Let me be direct with you about something that the Western press has not found the vocabulary to explain clearly, because explaining it clearly would require them to acknowledge something they have spent decades denying. What happened at the Arab League summit this week is not a diplomatic curiosity. It is not a regional procedural adjustment. What the Arab League's formal vote to restore Iran's role as a co architect of regional security represents is the single most significant realignment in Middle Eastern geopolitics since the 1979 revolution. That is not hyperbole. That is the honest assessment of what has taken place, and the silence around it in Western coverage tells you more than the coverage itself. I want to walk you through what actually happened, why it happened at this specific moment, what it means for American strategic interests in the region, and what the next 2 years look like from the perspective of everyone involved. In the next 18 minutes, we are going to cover three revelations that connect dots the mainstream media is treating as separate stories. First, why the Arab League vote is the product of a strategic calculation that has been building for 3 years, not a sudden emotional response to recent events. Second, what specific American policy failures created the conditions for this outcome, and why those failures were not accidental but structural. And third, what the restoration of Iran's regional standing means for the network of American military installations, diplomatic relationships, and economic arrangements that constitute the infrastructure of American power in the Middle East. Subscribe now if you are not already subscribe, because the next 12 months in this region are going to move faster than anything we have seen since 2003. And you need this level of analysis to understand what is coming. Let us start with the foundational context, because there is a narrative about Arab-Iranian relations that Western audiences have been fed for so long that it has become invisible. It is simply assumed to be the baseline reality. The narrative is this: Arab states and Iran are natural enemies. Their conflict is ancient, theological, ethnic, civilizational, Sunni against Shia, Arab against Persian. This narrative has been enormously useful to specific actors, most notably the American foreign policy establishment and certain Gulf monarchies, because it frames American military presence in the region as a buffer against Iranian aggression rather than as a force of occupation. And it frames Gulf autocracies as defenders of an Arab identity, rather than as governments primarily interested in preserving their own domestic power structures. The narrative was always more complicated than this framing suggested. History, trade routes, religious pilgrimage patterns, and cultural exchange across the Persian Gulf tell a very different story, but the specific political utility of this narrative to American strategic interests meant that it was systematically reinforced in Western media, in academic analysis that was funded by Gulf state endowments, and in the diplomatic frameworks that Washington built throughout the 1990s and 2000s. What happened at the Arab League summit this week is, among other things, a formal declaration that this narrative no longer serves the interests of the Arab League member states. That is a geopolitical earthquake. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now let us talk about what specifically the Arab League did and why the timing is not coincidental. Announcement number one, the substance of the vote and what it actually authorizes. And this one matters more than the headline, because the specific language of what was agreed reveals a strategic framework that goes far beyond a symbolic gesture of regional reconciliation. The Arab League vote did not merely restore diplomatic relations with Iran or invite Iranian observers to regional forums. What the formal resolution establishes is a framework for joint security consultation between Arab League member states and the Islamic Republic of Iran on the specific question of regional stability and the management of conflicts within the broader Middle Eastern theater. The language used in the resolution's operative clauses is, according to multiple regional diplomatic sources cited by Al Jazeera Arabic and confirmed by Iranian state media the language of co-equal partnership rather than the language of conditional engagement. Iran is not being invited to participate in a process that Arab states design and control. It is being recognized as a co-architect of the framework itself. That distinction matters enormously. The difference between inviting a neighbor to your security meeting and acknowledging that the security architecture of your region cannot be designed without them reflects a fundamental reassessment of where regional power actually resides. And the specific language of co-equal partnership was not drafted carelessly. It was negotiated over months with full awareness of what it signals to Washington. According to reporting by Middle East Eye and multiple regional diplomatic correspondents, the resolution was drafted through a consultation process that involved the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, Iraq, and four additional Arab League members over a period of approximately 14 weeks before the summit. The final language was not improvised in a negotiating session. It was the product of sustained deliberation about exactly how far the Arab League was willing to go in formally acknowledging Iran's regional role. And the conclusion of that deliberation was further than Washington expected and further than the Western press has yet managed to convey. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the specific American policy failures that created the conditions for this vote. This is the part that American commentators are finding most difficult to discuss honestly. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the strategic consequences for American power in the region become impossible to ignore. The Abraham Accords, which the previous American administration celebrated as a historic breakthrough in Middle Eastern diplomacy, were built on a specific strategic calculation that Arab Gulf states could be persuaded to normalize relations with Israel, abandon their traditional position on Palestinian statehood, and anchor their security arrangements more firmly within an American-led framework in exchange for American diplomatic support, arms packages, and the implicit promise of security guarantees against Iranian pressure. This calculation contained a structural flaw that was visible to regional analysts at the time and that has now become undeniable. The calculation assumed that the concerns of Arab populations, as distinct from Arab governments, Asim about Palestinian rights were manageable political variables rather than foundational constraints on what Arab leaders could sell domestically. The events of the past 2 years have demonstrated with comprehensive finality that this assumption was wrong. The Arab Street, to use a phrase that American policymakers spent years dismissing as irrelevant because it prioritized popular sentiment over elite decision-making, has turned out to matter. The governments that signed or were expected to sign normalization agreements have found themselves facing domestic political pressures that they cannot ignore. And the American response to those pressures essentially to insist that the Abraham Accords framework was still viable, that the Palestinian issue was separable from Gulf security concerns, and that Arab governments should maintain their public commitments to Israel despite what was happening in Gaza was not a diplomatic miscalculation. It was a demonstration of how profoundly the American foreign policy establishment had misread the actual constraints that Arab governments operate within. The consequence of that miscalculation is the Arab League vote. When American policy fails to provide Arab governments with what they need to manage their domestic political constraints, those governments find alternative frameworks. The Iranian engagement is one such alternative. It allows Arab leaders to demonstrate to their populations that they are not subordinating Arab interests to American strategic priorities, while simultaneously engaging with the regional power that has the most demonstrated ability to influence the conflicts in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq that are the most operationally significant to Gulf security. Received. That is announcement number two. Announcement number three, and this one, almost nobody in the mainstream Western media is connecting correctly. The Arab League vote is not the end of a process, it is the beginning of one. And the institutional architecture it is building will constrain American options in the region for a generation. What the formal restoration of Iran as a recognized co architect of regional security initiates is a process of institutional construction. Joint security consultation, frameworks, require permanent structures, secretariats, working groups, communication channels, shared analytical capacity. The establishment of those structures between Arab League member states and Iran is not reversible through American diplomatic pressure after the fact. The relationships built through institutional engagement have a momentum of their own. The Saudi Iranian rapprochement that China brokered in 2023 demonstrated this dynamic. Once the institutional structure of restored diplomatic relations was in place, the relationship developed in ways that neither Washington nor Tel Aviv could manage through their traditional toolkit of pressure, incentive, and threat. The Arab League vote is a structural deepening of that same dynamic, now at the multilateral level, and structural changes in regional security architecture are not undone by changes in American administrations or by the specific arms packages that Washington might offer as an alternative inducement. Now, let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out, and the mainstream media is focused on entirely the wrong one. The story being covered is the diplomatic symbolism, the handshakes, the statements, the procedural details of how the vote was conducted and what dissenting voices said. These things are real, but they are not where the significance lies. The story not being covered is the specific implications for the network of American military infrastructure in the region. The United States currently maintains bases and military facilities in Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Kuwait, Jordan, and Iraq. Each of these facilities exists in the context of a bilateral security relationship between the United States and the host country. Each of those bilateral relationships was negotiated and maintained within a specific regional strategic context, a context in which American military presence was understood as a counter to Iranian regional ambitions and as the primary guarantor of Gulf security. The Arab League vote alters that strategic context. It does not immediately alter the bilateral agreements, but it changes the political environment within which those agreements must be renegotiated, renewed, or adjusted. Gulf governments that are simultaneously engaged in joint security consultation with Iran and hosting American military facilities are in a different negotiating position than they were before. They have more options, they have more leverage, and they have less domestic political need to absorb the risks that come with being publicly identified as the primary platform for American force projection in a region where that force projection has become deeply unpopular. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Consider the Peloponnesian War, when Athens overextended its strategic commitments, attempting to maintain alliances across the Aegean while simultaneously projecting power into Sicily. Dorantes game fai found sai mighting free me fashion sai wai. The allies it had cultivated through a combination of genuine protection and coercive tribute began to reassess their strategic calculus, not because Athens suddenly became weak, but because an alternative framework became available. The moment a credible alternative exists, alliance commitments that were maintained through a combination of interest and absence of options become subject to renegotiation. The Arab League vote is that moment, is that American dominance in the Middle East was never just about military capability. It was about the absence of viable alternatives. That absence is ending. So, where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths, because the next 2 years will be shaped by which of these trajectories emerges as dominant. Path one, managed American adaptation. In this scenario, the Biden or post-Biden American administration recognizes that the strategic environment in the Middle East has changed structurally and adjusts its posture accordingly. This means accepting Iran as a legitimate regional actor, renegotiating the terms of bilateral security relationships with Gulf states to reflect the new regional architecture, and shifting from a strategy of Iranian containment to a strategy of managed coexistence. The conditions required for this path are substantial domestic political shifts within the American foreign policy establishment, which remains deeply committed to frameworks that were developed in the 1990s and early 2000s and that have not kept pace with regional realities. Path 2, American retrenchment and regional multipolarization. In this scenario, the United States responds to the Arab League vote and the broader shift in regional dynamics by reducing rather than adjusting its engagement, drawing down military commitments, concentrating on bilateral relationships with the partners that remain most dependent on American security guarantees, and accepting a more limited regional role. This would accelerate the process of regional multipolarization and would create space for Chinese, Russian, and Turkish influence to expand in the vacuum. Path 3, escalation and countermobilization. In this scenario, the American response is to treat the Arab League vote as a threat to be countered rather than a development to be accommodated, to increase pressure on Arab governments to reverse or reinterpret the resolution's significance, and to attempt to reconstitute the Abraham Accords framework through enhanced arms sales and security guarantees. This path is the most dangerous because it requires Arab governments to choose between their domestic political constraints and American pressure in a way that is not sustainable. Governments caught in that bind tend to find ways to appear compliant while pursuing their strategic interests through alternative channels, which produces exactly the kind of opacity and unpredictability that makes regional security genuinely difficult to manage. I think we are on a trajectory toward Path 2, with elements of Path 3 likely to emerge from American political actors who refuse to accept the new regional reality. The Arab League vote is not reversible. The institutional architecture it initiates will develop with or without American engagement. The question is not whether the American era in the Middle East is ending. The question is whether the transition is managed with enough strategic intelligence to preserve American interests that genuinely matter, or whether it becomes a chaotic withdrawal that leaves a vacuum filled by conflict. Tell me in the comments what you think the Gulf states do next with their American bilateral security agreements. Tell me whether you think Washington can find the strategic flexibility to adapt, or whether the domestic political constraints within American foreign policy make that adaptation impossible. And we will be tracking every development in Riyadh, Cairo, Tehran, and Washington as this story develops. That is what this channel does. Subscribe now, share this analysis, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next video. There is a dimension of this story that I want to address directly because I think it is the one that the Western press is most fundamentally incapable of engaging with honestly, and that is the question of what this realignment means for the people who actually live in the Middle East. The framing that has dominated Western coverage of Middle Eastern geopolitics for the past 4 decades treats regional states primarily as pieces in a strategic game played by external powers. Iran is a threat to be contained. Saudi Arabia is a partner to be managed. Egypt is a stabilizing force to be funded. Iraq is a reconstruction project to be administered. The actual populations of these countries, their political aspirations, their economic needs, their cultural frameworks for understanding legitimate governance and regional order, these appear in Western coverage primarily as variables that complicate the strategic picture rather than as the primary actors whose interests should be central to any honest analysis. The Arab League vote is, among many other things, a symptom of what happens when that approach exhausts itself. The populations across the Arab world have watched over the past 2 decades a series of American-led strategic initiatives that promised to bring security and prosperity and delivered instead the destruction of Iraq, the fragmentation of Libya, the catastrophic escalation in Yemen, the prolonged civil war in Syria, and now what the International Court of Justice has formally described as a situation that meets the legal threshold for genocide in Gaza. Against this backdrop, the Arab League vote to engage Iran as a co-architect of regional security is not a betrayal of some natural Arab-American alliance. It is the formal acknowledgement that the alliance, as it has been structured, has not served the interests of the region's populations. That acknowledgement matters. It is not going to be reversed by a different American administration or a better crafted diplomatic framework or a more sophisticated public diplomacy campaign. It reflects a fundamental reassessment of interests that is grounded in lived experience accumulated over 20 years. There is also a specific economic dimension to the Arab League vote that is not being reported at all in the mainstream Western financial press, and that will become visible over the next 18 to 24 months. The restoration of Iran as a recognized regional actor opens the door to a reorganization of regional energy infrastructure that has been constrained by the sanctions architecture and the political isolation that American policy has maintained around Iran for 40 years. Iranian natural gas reserves are the second largest in the world. The regional pipeline infrastructure that could connect those reserves to markets in South Asia, East Asia, and through the Gulf states to global LNG markets has been economically viable for decades, but politically blocked. The Arab League vote does not immediately dismantle the sanctions architecture. That remains a matter of American and European policy, but it signals a political willingness among Arab states to pursue economic integration with Iran that will create pressure on the sanctions framework from the Gulf side rather than just from the Iranian and Chinese side. That is a structural change in the politics of sanctions enforcement that American policymakers have not yet begun to grapple with. According to energy sector analysis published by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and separate assessments from the International Energy Agency, the potential scale of Gulf Iran energy integration, if the political constraints are lifted, represents a reorganization of regional energy economics that would have significant implications for global energy pricing, for the competitive position of American LNG exports to Asia, and for the financial models underlying several of the largest infrastructure investment decisions being made by Gulf sovereign wealth funds right now. The people making those investment decisions are not waiting for Washington's permission to factor Iranian reintegration into their planning. They are already doing it. The Arab League vote has made that planning legitimate in a way it was not before. The picture that emerges when you look at all of these dimensions simultaneously, the formal security consultation framework, the implications for American military infrastructure, the economic integration potential, and the underlying shift in how regional populations understand the legitimacy of their government's strategic alignments, is not the picture of a regional diplomatic development. It is the picture of a civilizational transition. The Middle East, as it has been organized since the end of the Cold War, around American security guarantees, Gulf Israeli alignment against Iran, and a Palestinian cause acknowledged rhetorically but blocked structurally, is ending. What replaces it will be determined over the next decade. But the Arab League vote this week tells us clearly what the replacement will not look like. It will not look like what Washington has been managing. Watch the specific language that emerges from the Joint Security Consultation Framework over the next 6 months. Watch whether the Gulf states begin to publicly reduce the profile of American military facilities within their borders. Watch the energy sector investment decisions coming out of the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. Those indicators will tell you with far more accuracy than any headline whether this transition is as fundamental as the Arab League vote suggests, or whether it is the opening move of a negotiation that American diplomacy can still reshape. The questions I want you to carry from this analysis are these. Is there a version of American Middle East policy that adapts to this new reality in a way that preserves genuine American interests in stability, in trade, in preventing nuclear proliferation, without requiring the kind of zero-sum competition that has defined American engagement in the region for 40 years? What does a Middle East look like in which Iran is a recognized regional leader and the United States is a partner rather than a hegemon? And can the domestic political environment within the United States, which remains deeply attached to a set of Middle East narratives that were constructed in the 1990s, generate the political will to make that transition before the window for managed adaptation closes? Tell me in the comments what you think. Tell me whether you believe this is the beginning of the end of American strategic dominance in the Middle East, or whether you think Washington has the capacity to adapt. Tell me which of the three paths you think is most likely and what you think the timeline looks like. We will keep watching every development, every diplomatic signal, every energy deal, every military basing negotiation. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now, share this with everyone in your network trying to understand this region, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next analysis.